It was the 1970s movement that saw rock fans chuck out their 3-minute pop singles in favour of challenging albums. They were played by flamboyant keyboard players and virtuoso guitarists, all determined to show off their musical prowess. It was progressive rock. But what on earth was its attraction? Many pop fans didn't like it. They wouldn't dance to it, and they certainly couldn't understand it. To pop fans, prog rock was a self-indulgent musical cult that had spun out of control. But for music fans who prefer triple gatefold albums and long keyboard instrumentals over teen pop pin-ups and snappy chart hits, prog rock is heaven on earth. This series explores the unexpected origins of music genres we love, which means a long and winding road through the far-out backwaters of Yes, King Crimson and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. We'll learn about prog rock's true genesis. No, not that. But the keyboard antics of a forgotten Scotsman who only got into music because of a white elephant thrown out by his next-door neighbour. When we think of popular music from the 1970s, lots of us bring to mind dance floor shaking disco hits, or the eye-catching icons of glam rock. A fair few would plumb for the day-glow punk rock stars who came roaring in with a spit and a snarl. Far fewer of us would think of progressive rock. Maybe because not everyone gets it.
And I guess the question is, what is prog? What defines prog music? I would argue that it's complex music. It's getting away from the 3-minute pop song into 6-minute plus suites. It's classically inspired. It's very technically complex with complex time signatures. The musicians are getting away from 3 chords into as many chords as they can get.
I suppose it was a musical genre where you expanded the boundaries of what went on normally within the straight 4/4 format.
To me, it was called quite a few things in the early days. It was called orchestral rock, classical rock, progressive rock. I always liked the whole prog rock idea because it's, people have asked me what it means. I say it's called breaking the rules.
Critics of it would later call it kind of overblown and maybe even pompous. But there was a rich kind of diversity of artists and music within the banner of prog rock.
If you wanted to have a change of tempo or a change of mood in a song or a 3-minute introduction, why not? If a piece of music felt natural to run for 8 minutes, then it should run for 8 minutes. It shouldn't be limited by what a record company tells you should do.
And you know what? They never sang any love songs. You never got a prog rock song which went, you know what, you're so good looking and I really do like you and, you know, can we get it together, babe? None of that. It was all these convoluted lyrics and stuff that went on and on.
One thing that a lot of prog bands have in common is that they've got great keyboards. You know, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes, this kind of over-the-top keyboard style.
These solo keyboardists were often the driving force behind prog rock. But there's a pioneer of this playing style whose name is not so familiar these days.
There were lots of keyboard heroes of the 60s who kind of contributed to that sound. There's Brian Auger, there's Steve Winwood, there's Rod Argent of the Zombies. There's obviously Rick Wakeman's playing on as a session musician. But I think the unsung keyboard hero, who never gets any credit, is Billy Ritchie.
In the 1950s, in the village of Forth between Glasgow and Edinburgh, a young lad began the journey to being a future keyboard trailblazer.
It was an unusual start in that I wasn't really that bothered about music. My neighbour threw a piano out when I was about 7 or 8, something like that. And in that day and age, anything that was free, you took it in, whether you wanted it or not. You didn't brag about being a poet or a piano player. It wasn't kind of wise. So it was a kind of secret activity.
Billy's first band was a rock and roll combo called the Satellites, formed with some school friends when he was just 15 years old.
We went to the first rehearsal and they were trying to learn a song and they were really struggling learning it, and I was thinking, what's the problem? And I played the whole thing and they went, oh my God, you know. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, I'm good. The way they looked at me changed everything. It was like, wow, you know, status.
In those days, pop keyboard players usually sat at the side of the stage, allowing lead singers to take all the glory. Billy was having none of that.
He's actually playing the keyboards, standing up, and he's throwing focus away from the lead singer. Everyone's looking at him. He really is the main man on the keyboards, and that is kind of unheard of.
That came about because I didn't want to be one of the backroom boys. I didn't want to be the guitarist at all the limelight. I wanted to be the guy who was out front.
What color will you be? In 1964, age 19, Billy Ritchie got together with Harry Hughes and Ian Ellis. They eventually formed 1, 2, 3 and were drawn to the bright lights and hip sounds of swinging 60s London. Once in the capital, they started playing covers of pop hits in what would later be known as a prog style. A famous Soho music club became their home for a while.
Billy Ritchie and his band 1, 2, 3 have this residency at the Marquee. It's while he's here that all the greats of what will become prog rock see him play.
We took other people's songs and we tried to find unusual songs. Memphis Slim, I'm Lost Without You. He wouldn't have recognised what we did with it in the end.
Among the numbers covered by 1, 2, 3 were 2 little-known songs by 2 little-known artists. They would both go on to become superstars.
We took America by Paul Simon, not the one, the Leonard Bernstein one, the Paul Simon one. Paul hadn't even released it yet. We'd been to London with Cyril Stapleton, the band leader who was trying to record us. Nothing came of that, but we did get a demo of Paul Simon. So we said, oh, we'll do that. And I changed them beyond all recognition. We did a David Bowie song called I Dig Everything. That was the one where I put I changed this tune, I changed the whole tune and moved things around and put different verses in and put the Bach fugue in C minor in the middle of it. And of course he heard about it and came to the Marquee and renewed our acquaintance and he loved it. And we became, for a couple of years, him and I were great pals.
1, 2, 3 were pushing all the right buttons at the Marquee. In fact, the famous manager Brian Epstein, known as the Fifth Beatle, signed the band to his management company. But 1, 2, 3's unconventional sounds divided opinion in the audience.
People got very angry when we played because they wanted to dance or something and we'd be stopping in the middle and starting new tempo, tempi, whatever. And they would be furious and there'd be screams and howls of rage. People get amazingly angry. Half the audience were going, what the hell is this? And the other half, who were musicians, were all going, wow, you can do that. You can take a song, you can chop it into pieces, you can have different sections, different tempo.
Among those impressed by 1, 2, 3 were many who'd go on to become the leading lights of prog rock.
John Anderson from Yes was the barman next door at the Shas Club, which was part of the Marquee, really. And there was the guys from Sin, who later became the other members of Yes. And people like that. Robert Fripp spoke to me there. And Keith, of course, Keith Emerson, asked me why I stood and played.
Inspired by Billy Ritchie and others, Keith Emerson would soon establish a flamboyant style of his own.
He then forms the band The Nice, and he goes crazy on the keyboards, stabbing it with his knives and things like that.
He's sticking a knife into the keys so that it held the notes going, and then started messing about with it to make its pitch go, and switched it on and off and stuff, you know, to make kind of strange electronic noise.
But it's Billy Ritchie who's first doing that in a much more kind of low-key way.
Prog had many beginnings, and I think it would have happened regardless of any one influence. But certainly the early Yes, King Crimson, Nice, all were directly as a result of that. I mean, that's only a few of the bands, there's probably loads of others. As I said, it happened all over the country.
So Billy Ritchie's at the centre here. He knows David Bowie here, he knows all the great people. They all talk about what an incredible musician he was. And I would argue that if a lot of these people hadn't seen Billy Ritchie play, they wouldn't have taken their keyboard playing even further.
It opened their minds. You could do this, you don't have to do a song that way. You can... I never thought of that. I was like that. If it wasn't for the neighbours throwing at the piano, I wouldn't have been part of it. It was one of those, you know, accidents of time and chance.
If Billy Ritchie and his band 123 had been a key influence on the rise of prog rock, they were by no means the only one.
Progressive rock was the music that grew out of British psychedelia. Like some psychedelic groups went down sort of like the metal route or the hard rock route. Others kept the mellotron, which was kind of the key instrument in British psychedelia.
The mellotron was invented in the West Midlands in 1963. Birmingham, to be precise. It was able to store miniature tape recordings so that the keyboard would replay orchestral sounds.
And in some ways you can trace prog back to Pink Floyd, who are playing psychedelic music but getting more and more out there with what they're doing. They're playing longer and longer sets and they're getting more and more weird and out there. Again, they've got a great keyboard player in Rick Wright.
Another British band had a smash hit success experimenting with the mellotron in 1967.
Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues, which was like 24 hours in someone's life. And then the Moody Blues became one of the most important prog bands.
Nights in white satin, never reaching the end.
Among these early prog artists was a young pianist from West London, making his living in the capital's recording studios.
I was doing sessions for lots of other people by this time, by the late 60s, and very few were demanding, to put it politely. So I thought, there's got to be an answer to this. And the answer really came through all my classical training, because I started using that in the way that I played a lot, and started to get even more work. Well, play like you played on that, play like you played on that kind of thing. And it set me thinking that I really wanted to make some music that combined different facets of music. I mean, I remember when I first decided to go out with a lot of keyboards, there weren't even keyboard stands. They didn't exist. I went to a couple of companies and said, can you build me some keyboard stands? And they said, why? I said, because I want to take lots of keyboards out. They said, why? I said, because I do. They went, no, you're nuts. I mean, what I did initially, I used to go to furniture shops and buy chests of drawers, throw the drawers away and then slot the keyboards in there, because that was the only way we could take them around. I wish I'd patented sort of keyboard stands. I'd have made a bloody fortune.
Unlike in most modern musical genres, which saw teenagers rebelling against their parents, many heroes of prog rock had been actively encouraged by mum and dad.
The great thing was my father, who said, the classical training will give you the technique to be able to do anything you want. But what is more important is you've got to learn to understand all other different genres of music. So you've got to learn to play as many different kinds of stuff as you can. So from a young teenager onwards, 12, 13-year-old, I played in little dance bands, pally bands. I played in trad jazz bands. I played in country and western bands. I played in rock bands, blues bands. Anywhere I could play, anything I could do, I did. I played for weddings and funerals, in churches. I played at a strip club, pub strip club. Played quite a few wrong notes at that strip club, but I played in there. I did loads, everything that I could possibly do. I played in working men's clubs, and it was the best grounding you could ever have.
Though Rick Wakeman was in demand as a session musician, by the end of the 60s, he was itching to take his keyboard playing in another direction.
The music, what I wanted to do, didn't exist, so it was cool. Well, got to create it somehow. So I put together various projects. One of the things that was very important to me was to get away from this 3-minute formatted thing of a song, introduction, you know, verse, chorus, chorus, verse, solo, out, or whatever, which seemed to be a format that was done. And I discovered quite a few other musicians who felt the same.
For its first couple of years, progressive rock remained a niche interest, but by 1969, it had started to creep into the mainstream.
I think initially it was all the musicians would like it more than anything, you know, so they had a following from musicians more than the general public. But I think the songs in the end and parts of the songs therein were strong enough for people to connect with, and suddenly, you know, the audience grew and grew and grew and grew and grew.
From Argent to Van der Graaf Generator, and from Atomic Rooster to Jethro Tull, prog rock bands were springing up everywhere. What's more, in its early days, prog music was given a push by Radio Luxembourg, the first commercial radio station that could be heard in the UK.
Still waiting for
The show I'm best known for on Luxembourg was Jensen's Dimensions. And on that program I would play everything and anything and kind of reflect what publications like Melody Maker and Disc and Music Echo and Record Mirror, the music magazines of the time, the bands they were championing. And then I got to, when I got a good audience for the show, then I started, playing music that, not following other people's taste, but my own taste. And so I would play certain, bands, knowing that, say, Van der Graaf Generator had a following, I would play them. But then I'd also play something that I liked a lot from Rick Wakeman.
At the turn of the decade, Wakeman was still looking for his musical nirvana. He was about to find it with another of the new prog bands on the scene.
I was playing with a band called Straubs at the time, which was a folk rock band. Great band, great fun. And we supported Yes at a concert in Hull. And after Straubs had done their set, I sat in the audience because I thought, I'm going to watch this band, see what they're like live. And they came on and they were so innovative, it was unbelievable, because at that time all singers were 6'3", long greasy hair, and that's what they were. On comes the singer for Yes, John Anderson, who's like 3 foot nothing, like a little elf coming on and singing, and has an alto voice, not a tenor voice. And I remember sitting there, and it was just amazing. I thought, God, this is an amazing band. Cut a long story short, I joined them, brought in loads of keyboards, and we became a sort of progressive rock, orchestral rock band. The second album which we did, which was Close to the Edge, we brought in even more new stuff. But there was also a little bit of a familiarity from people go, we sort of know what we're going to expect, and it's gone to another level.
But it's the kind of swirling keyboards of Rick Wakeman that really make that album. John Anderson, of course, with his distinctive voice, it can't be ignored, but Rick really is at the fore on that particular album.
Yes would go on to be one of Prog's leading lights in the early 70s. But dozens of new prog bands were springing up across Britain, including a group who would eventually become mainstream superstars.
Genesis, another main prog band. Again, they come out of a kind of more normal psychedelic sound, but getting more and more prog in the 70s with Peter Gabriel at their helm.
Genesis for the first few albums were, and then they moved slightly more over to the right, and were, shall we say, deliberately more commercial, but still kept a lot of their prog elements.
My favourite of all of them was King Crimson, and I'm actually very proud because their reputation has held up very, very well.
King Crimson, born during that late 1960s prog bloom. Greg Lake performed vocals and bass guitar alongside virtuoso guitarist Robert Fripp.
Robert Fripp had previously been in a band called Giles and Fripp, who were a weird, out there, semi-proto-prog band doing crazy psychedelic numbers.
The first album, In the Court of the Crimson King, was absolutely sensational. And I believe it was all recorded on 4-track with lots and lots of bouncing across from track to track, which was remarkable.
The musicianship was unbelievable. And they came out with a song called 21st Schizoid Man, which was just unbelievable at the time, you know, and it was the way it was developing then, that prog rock thing.
First time I'd ever listened to Court of the Crimson King was late at night, and I thought, oh God, this is fantastic. And I could still feel that sense of wonder when you first heard it. I mean, they were using different instruments, they were using mellotron, they were making very different sounds.
It's got Robert Fripp's crazy guitar, it's mad, with pastoral interludes, it's got everything that we kind of think of prog in there.
King Crimson are still with us today, but Greg Lake left the band in 1970 to join up with Keith Emerson, who was leaving the Nice, and Carl Palmer from Atomic Rooster. And so it was that Emerson, Lake and Palmer became prog rock's first supergroup.
start. Guaranteed to blow your head apart.
By 1970, the prog rock movement was in full swing, thanks to a new generation of rock maestros who were not only superb musicians, but great showmen too.
A lot of the prog bands were actually incredibly entertaining. I mean, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, at their heyday, I mean, they were filling out stadiums.
There were free concerts in Hyde Park. You would flock to be with other people who liked the same thing that you did, and you were desperate to be part of it.
In the late 1960s, a technological breakthrough brought a seismic change to the world of rock music, and to prog rock in particular.
A man appeared called Dr. Bob Moog, and he changed the face of everything for keyboard players. And I consider that to be the instrument that changed the face of prog. Because before, all the instruments that keyboard players had, like a few electric pianos, there was a few different organs, hammers and a few others around, nothing could cut through like a guitar could cut through. And then Bob Moog developed, or invented, the Moog synthesizer.
In 1970, a portable version was released called the Mini Moog, which soon became a must-have for all keyboardists on tour.
It's a really lovely keyboard to play. It's all laid out really well. The filter's really good. It's powerful sounding synth. Has a good bendy pitch wheel and modulation. So, you know, keyboard players could then step up and be up there with the guitar players, you know, people like Rick Wakeman and, you know, they could get out there and do that.
And I remember getting my first one in 1970, playing the first, and I couldn't believe it. This thing would cut through concrete. And what was even more fantastic was guitarists hated it. Because you put it on stage, guitar player did his solo, yeah, look, aren't I loud? And it came to you and he's expecting everybody to go quiet. And you're louder than he is, because the sound would just cut through everything. Our guitarists hated it. That was the moment of joy when keyboard players could actually truly express themselves and be heard at the same time.
This Moogish moment was so liberating. Rick Wakeman soon started his own solo career.
I remember going to my manager, Brian Lane, who's still my manager now, and said I wanted to do an album, just a keyboard album, nothing but keyboards. And nobody got it. He got it, went, yeah, okay. And A&M Records got it at the time, so we did the 6 Wives of Henry VIII. And I remember speaking with the PR department after I'd done it, and they didn't know what they hadn't got a clue what to do with it, because none of the pieces were radio formatted. There was no vocals. It was just keyboards.
And then the synthesizers came in, and I'd missed that completely. I was still playing organ and piano. And Keith and Rick passed me with like afterburners on the motorway.
By 1971, the new Moog-inspired form of prog was taking the music world by storm. But 123, who had helped kick-start it all, had lost their way. Few would have predicted that during their heyday back at the Marquee Club.
Brian Epstein signed us on the strength of that, because it was kind of like something happening. But he died within, a few months of us signing us.
Brian Epstein's death in August 1967 had shocked the music world. While the great and the good paid their respects, media attention understandably focused on how it would affect the Beatles. But it was also a blow to Billy Ritchie, and turned out to be the one from which his band would never fully recover.
Robert Stigwood looked after us theoretically, but he already had Cream, and he just signed this band, the Bee Gees. And of course, all his attention was taken by them, and we kind of lost our way in NEMS, which was Brian Epstein's company. He had no idea what to do with us. We didn't sound like anybody else. He thought, they'll put them on a novelty tour. Robert Stigwood sent us on a cabaret tour among jugglers, and because we were so different, people had no idea how different we sounded. So we kind of fell by the wayside. Meantime, all the bands like Yes, The Nice, King Crimson are moving forward, and we've kind of lost our way. We've not made the records. We missed that moment.
123 never made a record, but they were eventually signed by Chrysalis Records. They recorded the first of 3 albums under the name Clouds in 1969.
And it's more a kind of like psychedelic pop album, but there are so many prog flourishes on there, especially in his keyboard playing, that if you listen to it, you can imagine what 123 must have sounded like at the marquee.
But the hold-ups in their career had been fatal. Clouds were no longer a new sound and never made much impact. To add insult to injury, Clouds were accused of copying other prog bands that had, in reality, been influenced by them.
I was a bit resentful, but the funny thing is you never say anything. You just thought, well, if they'd have acknowledged our influence, that would have been something. But they didn't do that. Apart from John Anderson, who always said we were his favourite band.
It was only in the 1990s that Billy Ritchie received his due credit. His old friend David Bowie spoke up in his favour in a magazine interview. As an unknown, many years previously, Bowie had defended Ritchie after a classic 1-2-3 performance at Epstein's Savile Theatre.
He wrote a letter defending us. These 3 Thistle and Haggis voiced bairns who had the audacity to face a mob of self-opinionated hippies with a brand of unique pop music which, because of its intolerance of mediocrity, floated us with a Hogarth cartoon and Beano. That was a quote from his letter, printed in the Record Mirror. So that was when he was unknown, so that was pretty much his take on us. It was nice of him, it was good of him to do that. He always spoke well of me. I mean, he stuck up for me even in recent times.
But in the early 1970s, Billy Ritchie faded into obscurity, while prog rock bands went stratospheric, pulling in like-minded fans attracted to prog's overblown, out-there sounds.
It appealed to a lot of students, both at secondary schools, 15 years and upwards, through to those at university or whatever. And it was mainly for those who, a bit like us, wanted a bit more than the pop music that you could hear all the day, which was great fun.
They weren't looking for hit singles on the record. They were looking for kind of almost symphonic, classical music was more of an inspiration than Elvis Presley and the Beatles. And you wouldn't necessarily want to be releasing singles either, because that was seen as selling out. So you were an album-oriented act, and that's where you should stay.
So when I was at school, there was this kind of real schizophrenia going on, which was basically this: if you liked singles, right, you were a thicko. If you liked albums, you were really intelligent, right? I like both, you see. So I was a thicko intelligent, I suppose.
Prog was very much about the albums. You know, you had your triple album and the gatefold sleeve, and it was a huge amount was about the artwork. So that as you poured over this music, you would be absorbing the artwork, and that would stay imprinted on your mind.
But I loved all the artwork that went with it, and I loved the fact that these bands weren't putting themselves forward, their image, their faces. They were putting an artwork forward.
You'd rush home, you'd put the vinyl on the record player, then you'd sit down and you'd read the sleeve notes, because sleeve notes were important then, and you'd find out the musicians that were on it and what the band had to say about what you were listening to. And that was all part of the experience of listening to a prog rock album.
So I said to my mate Pete Russell one day at school, I said, oh, can you lend me this album you've got? Because I was in the children's home, I didn't get albums, you see. And it was called Tales from the Topographic Ocean, and it was a triple album set, if I'm right, or double, one of the two anyway. And I spent the whole weekend, and it was like I was doing a test, and it was like, I've got to get this, because if I get this, then that shows you how intelligent I am, and you know. And I couldn't get it. I just couldn't get it. In the end, I had to give it back.
I did hear it once called prog. It was called Marmite. You either love it or you hate it. Nobody ever said, "Oh yeah, that's all right, that's okay." People either loved it and got into it, or they hated it. My argument always was, you know, you don't have to be an intellectual to listen to it. You can listen to it and just enjoy the music. Or if you want to look into it anymore, you can do.
Prog was the new breed of rock music, complex, challenging, and sometimes ponderous. Compared to the teen-friendly acts of the pop charts, prog attracted a more studious breed of fan.
Prog has this image of being music for Open University lecturers and kind of people sitting cross-legged, you know, stoned out of their gourd, watching a twiddly band go on for hours on stage.
Prog rock, his British public school boys, nearly all, virtually all boys.
In the early days, all the audiences were basically male because the women thought we were disgusting.
I think the prog rock guys were not exactly pin-ups necessarily, whereby the girls would wouldn't necessarily have pictures of Van de Graaff Generator on their bedroom wall the way they would have Donny Osmond.
I would say 90 to 95% of the audience were male. And that was the only sort of slight downside, because all the pop bands, they were 90 to 95% female audience who used to throw knickers at them, and we got synthesizer manuals. But it was interesting as the years developed, because more and more guys were dragging their girlfriends along, and a lot of them stayed. A lot of them really, really loved the music.
I think Rick was responsible for a lot of people kind of getting into it, because his music was always accessible. Less accessible were his stage costumes, in which he has suffered a lot of ribbing from over the years, because he would often appear in a gold cape or something similar.
He always gets singled out for making prog, too much about flowing gowns and cloaks and all that kind of wizardry and pre-Game of Thrones kind of stuff. It just didn't sit well.
And it became a sort of a bit of a feature. In fact, it became a bit daft, because I used to get fashion mags saying, "Have you got the new cape yet? Can we have an exclusive on the new cape?"
Capes or not, Rick Wakeman didn't have the monopoly of keyboard theatrics.
They probably thought, well, we need to put on a visual spectacle as well as playing this sort of quasi, quite serious music.
But I do think it's important, and I say it to a load of young musicians when they're playing, just, don't just change your shirt or put another clean T-shirt on and go out and play. Think about people who are watching you. Think about the whole overall experience that you're trying to give people.
But I think that was possibly the downfall, because their outfits were ridiculous. And people, I think, felt embarrassed by them. I think I did.
While hardcore prog fans lapped up the genre's increasing excesses, its look and sound appeared more and more eccentric to casual listeners.
Where prog went wrong, if it went wrong, was that it was experimental within certain parameters, which is crazy, because the songs got longer, the solos got longer, you started getting triple albums instead of doubles, which came after singles. It just became more bloated, I suppose.
They forgot about sensibility. You've got to keep the sense of a song. You've got to keep the body, the soul.
I write a tune and then I write the lyrics, not so much for the idea behind the lyrics, but for the sound of the words.
If you're going to be very clever in what you're playing, you must make sure you keep sense and taste there. And I think there was an awful lot of failures in that department. Great playing, but that's not everything.
And it got to the stage at the end where every possible gap we filled in, we've got a gap there of 2 seconds where there's only a keyboard platter. Oh, let's stick in another 36 notes. I could stick 40 in there. We'll stick 40 in. Let's stick something else in. And it just became so over the top and overblown.
It's like musical masturbation, because it's just completely self-indulgent. I mean, nobody else wants to listen to it.
I think most prog bands did their best work in the first 2 or 3 albums, and after that, it almost limited itself.
By the time you get onto the 3rd album and the 4th album, you often will get the press go, not as good as the 1st or the 2nd album. But what they forget is, it may well be better than the 1st or 2nd album, but they know a lot of the shall we say, ingredients that go into making that band sound. They know what the guitar player sounds like. They know what the keyboard player sounds. They know what the drummer sounds like. They know what the vocalist sounds like.
Progressive became a bit of a problematic term because it just meant more of the same in larger quantities.
Wary of this problem, Rick Wakeman left Yes in 1974. Other prog bands were chopping and changing members, and by the mid-70s, the scene was becoming increasingly incestuous.
In this era, band members would come and go from the other bands, enjoy it, and it would almost be like football transfers.
While prog rock was still in good shape at grassroots level, few bands were making commercially successful records. By the mid-1970s, only Mike Oldfield, better known for the guitar than the keyboards, had notable chart success. Progressive music was finding it hard to progress. So when punk rock crashed into the UK in 1976, it had the decadent stars of prog in its sights.
And they wanted to overthrow everything and anything that had been successful in music before they came. Or certainly that's what they said at the time, with the Sex Pistols right at the vanguard of all of that.
Punk kicked, or sort of semi-kicked prog into touch. It was sort of like an antidote to prog having sort of almost disappeared up its own backside.
By the mid-70s, I think most of those bands were running out of steam. I think it's a bit of a misconception that punk killed prog because it was pretty much already over. And by 77, Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes were putting out singles again, almost as if they had to like slightly go backwards and make shorter songs.
Both Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer achieved their only top 10 single hits in 1977. In any other musical genre, this might have been considered the band's peak, but in the prog world, the reverse was true. To some, these hit singles were the sign of bands reaching out to the mainstream in desperation. By the end of the 70s, prog had dwindled to a cult genre.
It was music that nobody I knew talked about at all. There were records, if you saw them in a second-hand shop, you would just ignore them because you were told to ignore them, really.
I think it's looked back at now by the mainstream with a sense of embarrassment. Oh God, what was that all about? You know, noodly music played by men with strange wispy beards. But it's influenced the mainstream in ways that I don't think people realise.
Genesis, originally a prog band who had moved into the mainstream, still displayed a prog edge many years later. In the 1980s, it was common to hear prog-style instrumental flourishes in the middle of hit singles. Even heavy metal bands like Iron Maiden threw in the odd complex guitar solo and tricky time signature.
I would argue, and I'm sure many prog purists would disagree with me, but Muse and Radiohead, certainly with these complex, technically difficult songs, they're certainly taking things from prog. There's another band, the Mars Volta, who were very popular in America when they were existent, who really just took prog ideas and ran with them. Now, I don't think anyone will go, that's prog, but it clearly exists because prog happened.
Prog never died, it just went on holiday for a bit.
I go on holiday to Spain on a charter aeroplane. I'll earn more money if I'm able. No charge, thank you, Mabel.
And it's interesting now that there's still an audience for that particular genre. You still get people, magazines and special compilations dedicated to the prog rock sound and the prog rock era to this day.
The young generation, the new generation, and I'm talking probably the 40s and under now, or even, well, shall we say the mid-30s and under, they don't date anything. They were born into it, it exists. So they don't stamp a date on it. And I learned a massive lesson a few years ago in Buenos Aires. I was outside a hotel, did a show the previous night before, and there was a young lad outside, spoke very good English, and he had a vinyl copy of my Six Wives of Henry VIII. And he said, Mr. Wakeman, would you sign this for me, please? And I said, yeah, OK. And I was signing, and I said, what do you like about this old music? How old are you? He said, I'm 16. And I said, well, what do you like about this old music then? And he just took the album and looked me right, and he said, it may be old to you, Mr. Wakeman, but it's new to me. He said, I only heard this for the first time 2 weeks ago. It is new. Always remember that at every concert there are people who are hearing it for the first time, and it's new. Something will always be new for somebody. Don't forget that. It's a 16-year-old kid. And he walked away, and I remember going back into the hotel de foyer where my drummer, Tony, was. And he said, you look shell-shocked. And I said, I've just been taught the biggest lesson of my life by a 16-year-old kid.
Billy Ritchie and Rick Wakeman had very different careers. One was the forgotten man, the other became arguably the biggest prog star of them all. But they share in one achievement. Together with all the other players in our story of progressive rock, they tore up the guidebook for what could and couldn't become popular music and wrote their own.